By the year 1260, the Mongol Empire had never lost a major battle in the West. Not once, in 30 years of conquest, had an army managed to stop them in open combat. Kingdoms surrendered before the Mongols even arrived. The ones that didn't were made examples of. 2 years earlier, Hulagu Khan's forces had surrounded Baghdad, the seat of a caliphate that had ruled the Islamic world in some form for 500 years. The city fell in less than 2 weeks. The caliph was executed. Scholars still argue over how many people died in the days that followed, but even the more conservative estimates run into the hundreds of thousands. Baghdad's libraries, famous across 3 continents for holding centuries of accumulated science, medicine, and philosophy, were destroyed along with almost everything inside them. By the start of 1260, Mongol armies had pushed further west and taken Aleppo, then Damascus, 2 of the largest and oldest cities in the region. Egypt was next on the list, and everyone on both sides knew it. Egypt, at that exact moment, was not in a strong position to resist anyone. It was run by a fragile new government, made up of former slave soldiers called Mamluks, who had seized power from the previous dynasty only a few years earlier and were still consolidating control. Their sultan, a man named Qutuz, had come to power through a coup of his own. He had every reason to believe his kingdom was about to become the next Baghdad. The Mongols sent envoys to Cairo, carrying the same message they'd sent to nearly every capital before it: surrender the city, tear down its walls, and submit, or share Baghdad's fate. It was less a negotiation than a formality. That message had worked on rulers from the Pacific coast of China to the shores of the Mediterranean. Qutuz didn't send a reply through the usual channels. He had the envoys executed, and their heads mounted on the gates of Cairo, where anyone entering or leaving the city would see them. By the diplomatic standards of the era, that was as close to a formal declaration of war as it got, and everyone understood it that way. It was also, on the surface, an act of near-suicidal defiance against the most feared military force on earth. But Qutuz was betting on something the Mongols hadn't planned for and couldn't control. Months earlier, the great Khan Möngke, ruler of the entire Mongol Empire, had died on campaign in China, over 4,000 miles from Syria. Mongol succession law required every senior commander with royal blood to return home and take part in choosing the next great Khan. Hulagu, who had personally overseen the destruction of Baghdad and was next in line to push into Egypt, pulled the bulk of his army east toward the succession dispute. What he left behind in Syria was a much smaller garrison force under a general named Kitbuka. It was the first real crack in Mongol strength anyone in the region had seen in decades, and Qutuz and his most capable general, a hardened commander named Baybars, decided to use it before it closed. There was still one problem in the way. The Crusader states held a narrow strip of coastline around the city of Acre, and the Mamluk army would have to march directly through Crusader territory to reach the Mongols in Syria. Kitbuka had already reached out to the Crusaders, hoping they'd join the Mongols against a common Muslim enemy. They refused. Whatever the Crusaders thought of the Mamluks after more than a century of fighting them, they'd seen firsthand what the Mongols did to cities that resisted, and they judged that threat to be the larger one. The Crusaders let the Mamluk army pass through their lands unharmed, and even resupplied it along the way, an arrangement neither side advertised loudly at the time. By early September 1260, both armies were converging on a valley in Galilee, known as Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath. Historians still argue over exact troop numbers on both sides, since the surviving chronicles disagree with each other. Kitbuka's remaining force is generally put somewhere between 10 and 20,000 men, a fraction of what Hulagu had commanded at Baghdad 2 years earlier. The Mamluks likely matched that number, or slightly exceeded it. On paper, that alone doesn't explain what happened over the next few hours. This came down to ground and timing, not raw numbers. Baybars led the Mamluk vanguard ahead of the main army and opened with a series of skirmishes against Kitbuka's forward scouts, engaging just long enough to draw attention, then pulling back each time the Mongols pushed in response. To Kitbuka, it read exactly like what he'd seen in every campaign before this one. Every army his forces had faced eventually broke and ran, usually sooner rather than later. So he pushed his cavalry harder, chasing what looked like a collapsing enemy, deeper into the valley, further from the open ground, where Mongol horsemen usually had every advantage. What Kitbuka didn't know was that Qutuz had already hidden the bulk of the Mamluk army in the high ground and tree cover, ringing the valley, out of sight, waiting for the exact moment his cavalry committed fully to the chase. When that moment came, the trap closed fast. Mamluk forces poured down from both flanks at once, and the fight that had looked like a Mongol pursuit turned into an encirclement within minutes. Kitbuka's cavalry, caught between the valley walls with no room to maneuver the way they were trained to, had to fight a battle on ground they hadn't chosen. For a while, it genuinely wasn't decided. Kitbuka's forces had broken out of worse positions than this before, and his center held long enough under pressure that the Mamluk left flank actually started to buckle. There was a real window, maybe only minutes long, where the ambush could have failed. According to the chroniclers who recorded the battle in the years afterward, this is the moment Kutuz threw off his own helmet so his soldiers could see his face clearly, rode directly into the collapsing line himself, and shouted for his men to hold their ground rather than retreat. Whether every detail of that account is exactly accurate, or shaped a little by hindsight and propaganda, is something historians still debate. What isn't in question is that the Mamluk line held at that exact point, and the battle turned there rather than the other way. Once the line held, it didn't take long. Kitbuka's force broke apart under the pressure from both sides. Cavalry that had never lost a major engagement anywhere in the west ran from the field, some cut down in the retreat, others scattering into the surrounding hills. Kitbuka himself refused to run and was captured on the battlefield, then brought in front of Kutuz. He wasn't offered the chance to be ransomed, which was common practice for a captured commander of his rank. Kutuz had him executed on the spot, in the same valley where the Mongol advance into the Islamic heartland had just come to an end. In the weeks after Ain Jalut, Mamluk forces swept back through Syria, retaking Damascus and Aleppo, and clearing out the smaller Mongol garrisons Kitbuka had left behind to hold the region. For the first time in living memory, territory the Mongols had conquered was being taken back, not by a rival empire with an army to match theirs, but by the people they had conquered it from in the first place. News of the defeat spread through the Islamic world in a way few military events ever had, in an era when news traveled at the speed of a horse. For 2 years, every ruler from Persia to Egypt had operated on the same working assumption, that resisting the Mongols meant annihilation, full stop. That assumption no longer held, and it changed how other rulers in the region calculated their own odds against Hulagu's empire. Hulagu himself, who never set foot on the battlefield at Ain Jalut, reportedly wanted to send an avenging force straight back into Syria. He never got the chance. A new war broke out against a rival Mongol faction to the north not long after, and it consumed his attention and his army for the rest of his life. Back in Egypt, the celebration didn't last long for everyone involved. Baybars had reportedly been promised the governorship of Aleppo for his role in the victory, a reward for leading the vanguard that had baited Kitbuka into the trap in the first place. It's the kind of promise that gets made easily before a battle, and forgotten just as easily after one. Kutuz reneged on it. On the march back to Egypt, somewhere near the town of Salihiyah in the Sinai, Baybars and a small group of fellow officers caught Kutuz away from the bulk of his guard. Accounts from the period differ on exactly how it happened. Some describe it happening during a hunting trip, others during what looked like a farewell embrace, but the outcome isn't disputed by any of them. Kutuz was stabbed to death by men who had fought beside him at Ain Jalut only weeks earlier. Baybars was proclaimed sultan within days of the assassination. The general who had led the vanguard that lured the Mongols into the ambush now sat on the throne of the man he'd helped kill, ruling the empire that ambush had just saved. Ain Jalut marked the farthest west and south the Mongol Empire would ever push in that direction. The empire kept expanding for decades in other regions, into Russia, into parts of Southeast Asia, but the border it drew through Syria in September 1260 barely moved again for the rest of the century. For Egypt, the battle did more than stop a single invasion. With Baghdad destroyed and the old caliphate gone, Cairo effectively became the new center of political and religious authority in the Islamic world, a position it held for well over 2 centuries under the dynasty Baybars founded in the aftermath. Baybars didn't stop at Ain Jalut either. He spent the next 17 years as sultan, turning the same army against the last Crusader strongholds along the very coast it had marched through to reach the Mongols in 1260, and by the time he died, most of those Crusader footholds were gone too. Historians still debate how differently the following centuries might have unfolded if a smaller, temporarily weakened Mongol force hadn't run into a Mamluk army willing to bet everything on a single ambush in a valley named after Goliath. What isn't up for debate is what happened on that one afternoon in September 1260. An army that had never lost. If you want to see what Baybars did next, when the same general who ambushed the Mongols turned that same army on the last Crusader kingdoms in the Holy Land, that's the next video in this series. Subscribe so you don't miss it.